Hi everyone, welcome to the first mission critical moment from SQL HA. My name is Allan, and to start off with, I figured I would do something that was near and dear to my heart, something that some of you may have heard me speak about quite a few times. I've done a few blog posts on it, and that's the use of proper terminology, in this case active passive and active active as it relates to cluster configurations of SQL Server. Without further ado, let's get started.
To take us on our journey as to why you shouldn't be using active passive and active active, we need to start where clustering did for SQL Server, and that's with SQL Server 6.5 and 7. Back then, clustering was also in its infancy in Windows Server. It started off as Wolfpack and Beta, and then was formally introduced in Windows NT 4.0. So how did things work back then? And how do we really get active passive and active active? Well, clustering back in those days only supported two servers or nodes participating in the cluster. SQL Server, for its data, required some form of shared storage, and the entire thing, when it's clustered in Windows, was called Microsoft Cluster Service, or the commonly known name as MSCS. We'll see later on that that name changed, but back then, that's what it was. So when we wanted to cluster SQL Server 6.5 or 7, we would do an installation. We'd put the binaries as well as the data, log, backups, all that stuff on the shared disk, and that's how we derived active passive. Totally makes sense, completely appropriate at that point. If we wanted to have another installation of SQL Server, we would do the same thing on the other node of the MSCS, and that's how we got to active active. Pretty straightforward. But keep in mind, at this time, this is all we could literally have. You could never have any more than two nodes or two installations of SQL Server. However, when Microsoft released SQL Server 2000, that was really a big deal. Why? Because instances were introduced. And instances are the way we install SQL Server to this day, including on Linux, although Linux is still slightly different in other ways, but we still call everything instances. And an instance is the installation of SQL Server, which is different than how other RDBMSs may refer to an instance. And what that allowed you to do is to have more than potentially two installations of SQL Server on a given cluster of Windows Server. The formal name at that point for the clustered implementation of SQL Server was called a failover cluster instance, or an FCI. And because now things like the OS could potentially go beyond two nodes, and there are some other name changes, really the whole thing, both at a Windows layer and at a SQL Server layer, things are changing. So let's have a look at what I'm talking about. So first of all, one of the changes I want to point out to you here is that no longer is MSCS valid, and it hasn't been valid for nearly 20 years, yet I still see it everywhere. Drives me batty. The worst offender, I think, quite honestly, is VMware, and I'm trying to work with them on that. In Windows 2000 Server and Windows Server 2003, both variants, 2003 and 2003 R2, the clustering portion of Windows is called a server cluster. I should say was, because hopefully none of you are still using it. In Windows Server 2008, that was renamed to be a Windows Server failover cluster. Now that poses a challenge because from a SQL Server perspective, we call the feature failover clustering, and we have failover cluster instances. But let's look at this from an architecture standpoint. So here I've got an example that has 4 servers or nodes participating in this Windows Server cluster configuration. And let's say I install an instance. I install a very simple configuration that can live on two potential servers. That means here, FCI1, which doesn't have the prime next to it, is owned by node 1 there, and the prime is somewhere it could fail over to. Then I deploy another FCI in this cluster that could potentially run on all four nodes, but is currently running on node 2. I then deploy a third FCI where it's owned by node 3 and could potentially fail over to node 4. And finally, a fourth FCI owned by node 4 can't run at all on node 3, but could potentially fail over to nodes 1 and 2. You can see this is a lot more complicated than the previous one, where at most we could have two installations. So, what do we call this? Is it active passive? No, because you have two ones that could potentially be active passive, but that doesn't account for FCI2 or FCI4, so thanks for playing. Is it active active? No. How could it be? Because you've got four nodes here, you've got four FCIs. Active active doesn't even come close to being accurately describing this picture. You have things potentially running everywhere, but that's not active active. So, again, thanks for playing. Is it active 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 active? Well, if you've got 64 nodes in your Windows 2016 cluster, are you going to have 64 actives? No. In this case, all four nodes are currently running an instance, but again, this is not really indicative because you have four nodes running things, but we could have potentially even more instances. So again, I say, not happening. Finally, there's a subtle change there. In this case, nodes 1, 2, and 4 are all owning things, but node 3 isn't owning anything at all. So is this one active, 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 passive? Now, you wouldn't really say active, active, passive, active, although that's, if you want to go technically, that's sort of what you see here. But again, this is a big fail because one node wouldn't be running anything. So again, not happening. What about the Linux side of FCIs? The good news is that you can configure an FCI when you're using Linux, and it uses Pacemaker as the underlying cluster. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are some differences, and one of the main ones which affects FCIs directly is that you can only have a single FCI in a Pacemaker cluster. This is because on Linux you can only install one SQL Server instance per server, which is the equivalent to a default instance. Even if you have up to the maximum number of 16 nodes, you can still only have one FCI. Active passive really isn't applicable here at all. It's just you have an FCI, and that's it. So, how do availability groups fit into this active passive, active active picture? The simple answer is they don't and never did. Think back to what I said earlier around SQL Server 7. I mean, we were hosting an instance of SQL Server on the server, right? The whole thing was running there. Even in 2000 and later with FCIs, same thing. We're running a whole installation of SQL Server on a given server, right, or node of the cluster. In the case of availability groups, you're hosting the resource, but you're not really running an instance. Active is relative in this case and does never really apply, but let's go down this little exercise and you'll see where it really doesn't make sense. So assume here that you've got a 4-node cluster, either Windows Server failover cluster or Pacemaker. Each one has its own standalone instance because you don't have to have an FCI to have an availability group. I could configure, say, an availability group only between instances 1 and 2, one between instances 1 and 3. I could have an AG that spans all 4 of these instances. And then let's say I create another instance, or install another instance, I should say. And then I create an availability group between that instance and instance 2 on that second node. These are very commingled. This is very different because it's also database level protection. SQL Server is sort of your point of record. It's using the cluster for certain things, but it's not the primary, shall we say, focus, if you will. So active active and active passive don't mean anything at all here. So how should you reference this stuff when you're talking about it? Well, if you're talking pre-Windows Server 2008 where they started using failover clustering as a feature, we usually just used to say a single instance failover cluster or multiple instance failover cluster. For obvious reasons, that's a bad idea now. Now I'll say things like I've got n number of FCIs running on a Windows Server failover cluster, or I've got a single FCI on a Windows Server failover cluster or a pacemaker cluster. I've got a 4-node Windows Server failover cluster with n number of FCIs. You see, I'm being very specific here because really we're talking about two different things, the clustering layer of Windows and what you're doing in SQL Server. Now, AGs complicate this because they also can run on a cluster. So you say things like, I've got 3 AGs on a Windows Server failover cluster. That makes sense. Now you could go into the node configuration and it's only running on nodes 1, 2, and 4 or whatever, but point is you got to be very specific here. But I will tell you, and it drives me nuts when I see this on SQL Help hashtag on Twitter and elsewhere, never ever use generic stuff like I have a SQL cluster or I have an AG cluster. Both of them are inaccurate. Both of them aren't even things. You have a Windows Server failover cluster or you have a pacemaker cluster of which you build an FCI or an AG on top of it. So please don't ever say that. The bottom line, you shouldn't be using active passive and active active because they haven't been real quote unquote things since SQL Server 7. And that's a long time ago. Always remember the ABCs of clustering SQL Server. Always be clear about what you're referring to when it comes to cluster configurations of SQL Server. I hope you enjoyed this first mission critical moment, and we'll see you next time.